Was the Roman Gladius good? But not as part of the legionaries' military equipment, not as the sword that conquered an empire, but independently, on its own. Was it good? Let's see. In a previous video, we analyzed how the Roman Gladius was used, where it was carried, and how it was drawn. I'll leave the link up here in case you want to watch it. But in this video, I want us to look at the Gladius as an independent weapon, not as part of the military equipment carried by the Roman legionary. Was it good? Is it true that when the legionaries conquered an empire, they carried this weapon? When the legionaries defeated the Dacians, Germans, Britons, and Gauls when they conquered Hispania, they did it carrying the Roman Gladius. This might lead us to believe it's absolutely true. The fact that they carried this weapon implies that this weapon was an excellent piece of combat equipment. However, the Roman legions had many good things, many decent things, and some bad things. In the end, if you have a lot of decent things and you add them up, you can get something really good. Even if none of those pieces is exceptional, working together they achieve something incredible. As I mentioned in the video I referred to earlier, this weapon is very good for thrusting attacks, and it's also good for slashing attacks. But you have to keep in mind that it was just a simple piece. Of all the Roman military equipment, it had to be accompanied, or was usually accompanied, by Roman armor. Whether it was the lorica hamata, the lorica segmentata, the lorica squamata, whichever they wore, and the Roman shield. Before continuing, I wanted to show you, if you see this shield I have here, well, it's a teardrop shield that I'm making to show in future videos. This will be blue with a white cross. I've been searching for designs and this one appealed to me the most, so that's it. I hope that in the next videos it can already be displayed along with the rest of the shields, and now let's continue. As we all know, this sword is short. It's short compared to the contemporary swords of the Celts, the Tazios, or the Hermanos. I'm not going to compare it with medieval swords because obviously the hilt was already more elaborate, the steel was better, but in terms of length, we can compare them to see how it was used in combat. And of course, if we compare it, for example, with this sword that I've already shown you several times, the Viking one, we can definitely notice the difference. Look, here you can see it. A difference in length, of course. This one is longer, and just those extra centimeters give the warrior who wields it an advantage on the battlefield. If we're given a choice of weapons and we have to fight with one of them, without armor and without a shield, choosing this one over this one would be a bad idea, just because of the length. In another video, I'll go deeper into why having a longer sword than your opponent already gives you an advantage. However, for now, of course, I'm going to give you a few quick pointers, and of course, I'll also comment on them. 2 exceptions to the idea that the longer one is always better. It turns out that if we want to face an enemy who has a longer sword or a spear, to be able to reach him, we will have to get inside his, let's say, range of reach. Redundancy aside, this means here we have an example of a longer sword that when we want to hurt him, if you notice, we have to get inside his reach. Then the opponent could reach me before I can reach him. So what happens here? That we will start at a disadvantage? This doesn't mean starting from zero. We are going to lose no matter what, because in the end, our skill as warriors will also come into play. Being able to parry the sword, make a feint to dodge it, whatever it is. But it's undeniable that we're already starting at a disadvantage. The only exceptions are the protections. This is something that in recent years in games, movies, and series has started to be shown, and it's something that movies that are already a few years old completely ignored. Heavy armor prevents him from taking damage, especially in certain areas. This means that if I'm covered from head to toe in my heavy armor, I could get close and take one or multiple sword attacks without them causing me any harm. And therefore I could overcome that difference in blade length. I could surpass it and then be on equal footing to attack my opponent. In this way, we see that when armor comes into the equation, blade length loses, so to speak. Its meaning. Not its meaning, but the advantage it gave to the warrior who had a longer weapon. And here, for example, we can see why in the Middle Ages the use of blunt weapons, hammers, became so popular. Maces, the renowned Morning Star, were designed not to cut, but to deliver blunt force. A blow that, even if it didn't pierce the armor, would cause severe bruises to the knight inside the armor. We will get to know these weapons now. I would like to highlight, for example, a dagger. If we are two knights in heavy armor from head to toe, we have mentioned that longswords would be useless to us. We would have to use blunt weapons, but I suggest you consider a dagger. If we manage to get into close combat with a dagger, it becomes super easy for us to get around the armor and stab the dagger through a gap at the neck, lift an arm and stab it into the armpit. Obviously, it will depend on the protection the knight is wearing underneath. But the dagger is still an option, an alternative to longswords, not as the main weapon, but as a secondary weapon. And to illustrate this with something I'm sure you've seen, what comes to mind is the first season of Game of Thrones. When you cry, Mormont is defending you. Does Drogo's tent have one? There's some kind of duel with some kind of... No, there's no duel. And on the contrary, he launches an attack with his sword at the hip, an attack that would have sliced anyone else. But since Jorah Mormont was wearing armor, this attack amounted to nothing. It doesn't even scratch him. He simply blocks the weapon and strikes back with his sword. On the contrary, it's still a series, but here it's illustrated perfectly. Like armor. It's not that it makes the wearer invincible, but it does make them pretty hard to hurt. And for those of you who like to play, I'll remind you of this game. Kingdom Come Deliverance is a game set in the Middle Ages, where the use of armor and how it made you nearly indestructible against long weapons is shown perfectly. To conclude this section, let's emphasize or say that armor made swords practically useless. And they made it so that either daggers, as I mentioned before, or blunt weapons were used. Especially the latter, because these didn't try to cut or pierce the armor, but rather to deliver such a strong blow that it would cause bruises underneath the armor. To the body of the warrior wearing it, going back to the Romans. Taking all this about armor into account, because those of you who know something about the Romans, which I'm sure is almost all of you, know that they wore the lorica hamata, the segmentata, the squamata. They wore armor. This means that we're already reducing the penalty they had for having a short sword. And now the other exception. Which one is it? The shields, for example, the round shield that I mentioned in the previous video. Up here, I'll also leave you the link to the round shield. Let's suppose that now I'm only carrying a shield, not wearing armor. Well, the round shield also reduces the disadvantage of the short sword. Well, in the end, I can move forward, block the opponent's strike, and then step in, move forward, and attack him with the sword. Let's say I've also reduced his advantage of having more reach since I've blocked his attack with my shield. And if we switch the round shield for the Roman scutum, shall we take a look? This way, what we achieve is to have a huge shield that protects our body. And by fighting in formation, we have the same shield. Here wielded by a comrade with his own Gladius, there are several more. We are forming a wall from which our swords protrude, and we are also forcing the enemy to rush at us to bunch up. And what advantage do we gain from that? Well, that their long swords won't be as effective. In the video where I was telling you how the Gladius was used, I said, why can't the weapon be used as a cutting weapon? Do you remember what it was like? Because when you're in tight formations, when you attack like this, for example, or like this, you can hurt your teammates. And the same applies the other way around. If you're using long weapons, you won't be able to use them effectively. But what if we add Roman armor to this scutum? Well, we've got it. Everything is in our favor. It turns out we've eliminated every disadvantage and we've even turned it into an advantage. Because now this sword can go in and out of the formation as we please, but now I'm sure you'll say, but let's see, is it a good sword or a bad sword? If we analyze the Gladius in isolation, independently it's a bad weapon, it's a mediocre weapon. At least if we compare it to, for example, a foil, a saber, a bastard sword, or a simple spear. There we start at a disadvantage. And why do I say that these weapons would almost always defeat the Gladius? Well, because these weapons have been designed to be used independently, in isolation to fight in duels, without being accompanied by a shield. So if you face them against a weapon, that is only good when you carry a shield and armor. They are going to win. It's true that the spear can be used with a shield, but the spear is just so versatile. You make it longer and you have a pike. You keep it short and you can use it with a shield or with both hands. Wow, it's so versatile. But of course, what if we add the variables of the shield and armor to the equation? And we use the Gladius the way it was intended, that is, in formation, with a huge shield and with armor. Well then, the result is that the sword is going to be a brutal weapon, a weapon capable of conquering an empire. In fact, for example, let's put the sword aside, the Gladius, sorry. Let's imagine having a duel with a shield, but instead of carrying a round shield, you're carrying a scutum. The scutum excels in formations, and combined with the Gladius and armor, they're a brutal force. But a duel, carrying a shield, we would have little mobility, it would be very heavy, and ultimately we would be at a disadvantage against a shield, which was partially designed to be used on its own for duels. Although it's true that there are shields designed to be used in formations like, for example, the Greek hoplons. But you get what I mean. This one gives you much more mobility than the scutum. Well, we also have this one I have here. If you're interested in learning more about shields, let me know in the comments and I can make another video on the topic. Think about one thing. When the Roman Empire was, let's say, evolving, already in the late period, and abandoned the way of fighting of the legendary Roman legions, it also abandoned the scutum and the Gladius at the same time. Why? Because in the end, although the scutum, but only partially. But keep in mind that in the end, all Roman military equipment is good when used together as a whole. The individual pieces are not as effective as they turned out to be when used in the regions. Now consider one last thing, the Roman cavalry. In the time, for example, of the first emperor Octavian, the Roman cavalry, what sword did he use? He didn't use the Gladius, he used the Spatha. Why? Because first on horseback and then on foot. The Spatha gave advantages to the rider, which the Gladius turned into disadvantages. The Spatha was longer and more slender, which allowed the rider to reach the enemies from a greater distance when he was riding a horse. And on the ground, they didn't have the same formation, nor the same shields as the regular legionaries. Could they fight without having such a short sword that would put them at a disadvantage against enemy warriors? Well, that's it for today's video. Greetings and full strength to you.